Today I'm talking to Curtis Stone about the guy who wrote this book, Jean-Martin Fortier. Curtis has known him for years. He's been to his farm a bunch of times. We're going to talk about what we like about JM coming up in this one. Stay tuned. So recently you visited the new farm, the experimental farm of Jean-Martin Fortier, La Quatre-Temps, up in Quebec. What did you find most interesting about that?
Well, there's so much interesting stuff going on in that farm. It's like, a bit of context for people if they're not familiar with Le Farm des Quatre-Temps. It's a experimental farm that is funded by a billionaire. So the budget is limited. I mean, the guy who's funding it, he wants to see a return, right? But the nice thing about when you have an angel investor is they're not necessarily, they're not saying, I want 10% in a year or whatever. They want to see it happen, and they'd like to see a return at some point, but they're not really on your back to see a return. So they've got that freedom to be able to experiment with stuff. And so to say what's the most interesting thing is a tough one because there's a lot.
If you had to boil it down to something like you wish you could do on your farm that he does, if cost wasn't a factor, if scale wasn't a factor, what would you like to do?
Well, I would love to be able to operate on the scale and not have to worry about turning the bed so quickly, because it does create work. So one thing that they can do at JM's farm is that everything is in standardized to 10 block beds, 10 beds per block. They've got 45 of these blocks, and they've got 2 silage tarps on each side. So when a block is finished, it's just tarped. And so they have the time to be able to stale seed bed it and not have to worry about pulling out those weeds or flame weeding it and turning it over and planting it right away like what I do. And that's just part of my limitations on a very small land base, is I can't let time do the work. I love the idea of letting time do the work because it actually makes it less work. In order to do what JM does at my scale, I'd have to be at least 3 times the size of my farm, because I could harvest some crops and just do exactly what I said. I could let them sit and I can come back to them in time. Because I have to get in there right away, I don't have that luxury. And so that's one thing that I really like about it. And the way the farm is laid out has really paid a lot of attention to the local biodiversity. And they've got hedgerows in between all these bed blocks. And for me, it's beautiful. Whether those bed blocks with the hedgerows is actually beneficial. Like, there's no real hard numbers there, but I think that's what's great about the project, is that they're able to try these things and they don't need to see a return on the information or the economics of it right away.
Which is cool. Push the limits, try new technology, try new techniques, and that's the limiting factor for maybe a lot of people listening to this, is you need it to produce. If this is going to be your living, you can't afford to go out and just experiment. You got to start with some model that where there's some results, and do 5% of your time into experimentation or something like that, unless you're just dedicating your life to this cause of tinkering with all this. And maybe eventually get there like JM, as he didn't start there.
That's right.
We'll get to that later on in this one. But if you think about those fallow blocks, of the 45 different blocks that he has, how many are in production at a given time?
Maybe a little bit less than 3/4 in production right now. But having said that, that might be because it's fall. What often happens on a farm is you're just going to start planting out tons of stuff because you know that you're not going to get another rotation off those beds. And they do rotate their beds at JM's farm 2 to 3 times per bed. So they're very close to what I refer to as high rotation in my book. They're doing it there, and what JM has done on his farm is actually a lot of based on my book. I mean, I've been friends with JM for a number of years now, and I was with him right when that offer was made to him to start that farm, and he came to me and said, what do you think I should do for crops? And I said, you should just cash flow that thing right away, turn and burn, go high value, small veg, high price per pound, short turnover, just go that way to get cash flow. And it just so turned out that they found a gold mine in the restaurants in Montreal, which was more or less an untapped market for the food scene, because in Montreal, for some reason, hasn't really come onto that yet.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I know one thing he had some issues with at that farm earlier on was selling to distributors and wholesalers. They just wanted, so much of a cut, so much of a discount that it wasn't going to make it work. And he was doing a lot at some of the farmers market. I can't think of the big one.
Jean Talon
Market, where, there, I know one thing that was unique for him is he was one of the few farmer growers actually selling at that market. There's a lot of other farmers that were just selling produce they weren't growing.
It's a huge reseller market. I actually I'll have a video coming out soon with it, but I was just there 2 days ago, and it's all resellers. And it's kind of annoying because you look around and you go, wow, look at all this great stuff. I don't even think 80% of that stuff is imported. It's ridiculous. And they all get it from the same importer exporter who brings all this stuff. They just bring a truckload, buy a bunch of stuff, bring it to the market. Barely any of them grow it. And a lot of them lie about it too, which is even crazier. That's the kind of market they're competing in. And it is interesting there because you can't tell unless you're an educated consumer. You don't really know. You're walking around and some people will flat out lie to you. And so it is kind of tricky to stand out there. Fortunately for them, they've got brand power. JM is a well-known person and people know his farm and they shop there because of that. So, it's a lot of telling people and educating people at the market.
That's it. It's building your own brand, communicating with customers, building a loyal customer that wants to come back. I was talking with a couple farmers in the Midwest, and they were talking about how sometimes you can go to farmers markets there and you'll ask a grower, do you spray? And typically when people ask, do you spray, that's saying, are you using chemicals on your crops? But they may say, no, we don't spray, but they're using a granular pesticide or a dust on the ground. So they're not spraying, they're answering you truthfully there, but they're answering it in a way that kind of skirts around what's actually happening. So when you develop these relationships with customers and you can communicate exactly what you do, that's important. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, how when you were doing farmers markets, you used to make notes about some of your early customers.
Absolutely.
Things they talked about, how they were doing, their names, their families, what their interests were. And then you have those conversations and you build that loyal customer base who will come back and choose your farm over the next one. And that's how you can start to compete again in crowded markets where a lot of people are selling radishes. Why are they going to buy your radishes?
Exactly. And I had an opportunity to hang out with them at that market. JM wasn't there that day, but I was asking Danny, one of the guys there who does the market, and I said to him, is this most returning customers? And he said, yeah. It's like it's an 80-20 thing, which it's not surprising at all for anybody who's been in business or anybody that's done a farmer's market that 80% of your business is going to come from 20% of your customers. And it was exactly that. I was standing there watching them for a while. Every single customer who came up knew them, was chatting, it was a whole experience.
And if you think about the farm that's supplying the produce to that booth, Le Carton, it's a farm funded by a billionaire. People watching this aren't going to be able to relate to that. But if you think about the people that are watching that are running their own farm, want to start their farm, you can get lost in the awesomeness of the trials that are on that farm. What are some things, processes, techniques that somebody new could apply to their farm that doesn't require $1 billion bank account behind it to make it happen?
I think one thing that JM is very good at is the individual process of his crops. So from seed to harvest, what happens with this crop the whole way? I think JM's got a lot to offer. I know he's coming out with an online course soon, and it's going to be specifically that. To be honest, the things that's happening there specific right now isn't that much different from what he's done in the past. Is if we're talking about what's transferable to somebody with a low budget. Honestly, there's not that much going on different. They're using some new tools. They're trying some new things as far as, they've got this really fancy compost tea bubbler type thing that they're spraying on. I think what they're doing is, it's not about looking at that farm as a beginner. To me, that farm is looking at it as in, this is the epitome of what you could do with a big budget, and potentially after a few more years of this farm, figuring out what is the refinement process. Because I don't know if we can say it yet, basically, to answer your question. I don't know if there's an answer there, or at least that I can think of at this moment. But I was talking to JM on the phone yesterday, and it's like they spent a lot of money to start this farm, millions to start this farm. And I know that if he were to do it again tomorrow, he could probably do it on at least half the budget that they had. And that's where the value for the greater space is watching that process of refinement and then siphoning off that best information later on.
They make the expensive mistakes.
They make the mistakes, and this is what Nassim Taleb talks about in Anti-Fragile. It's just that history is written by the failures. History is written by the losers, and what he means by that is that the people that go out and make the mistakes, make the failures, spend the money, those are the ones that allow the 2.0s to come into it and go in lean, because they don't have to make all those mistakes. And so that's what's happening there. There's mostly success stories going on there, to be honest. Like, they are crushing it. JM was an experienced farmer going in, so this investor, hired the best he could for that farm. And so, but they're refining and refining and refining, making all these epic mistakes, spending a lot of money, so that we can all come and go, yeah, this works, this doesn't.
Yeah, so that's the cash money rolling on the farm JM of today, but you go back 10 years, and that's where the foundation of this book comes in, The Market Gardener. When he started out his original farm at La Grillinette, that was after a long kind of wanderabout of working at a whole bunch of farms. One thing I always found interesting about JM, and I think his fame, sometimes people forget where these people start, is he started his first year, they lived in a teepee. And I think he said that teepee got so nasty by the end of the year that they had to burn it. And he did it with a child, him and his wife Madeleine were farming these crops with a 1-year-old baby in the field with him that was on like a tether to keep track. He was very grassroots by the skin of your teeth, making it happen at this beginning. So while you have the billionaire farm now, at the beginning this is much of just grinding it out, and that's
Absolutely.
what put him in the position to get to where he was today.
Yeah, absolutely. Starting on a really tight budget forces you to make really conservative and careful decisions, and I think that is so important for any business person, especially a farmer, to figure out, because a billionaire, for one, isn't going to hire somebody who didn't come from that space. A billionaire wants a person who comes from learning how to do this on a shoestring budget, because that they're going to be a lot more careful with your money than if you just threw them a bunch of money and said, hey, I hope you figure it out. It's like that those kinds of opportunities don't come to somebody who has just had it thrown at them. There's that whole process of grinding it out and figuring out the hard way, which is going to lend itself way better when you're operating with a big budget.
That's it. There's that joke, how do you make $1 million running a business? You start with $2 million and you're left with $1 million after you lose $1 million of it. And this idea of constraint is something JM's talked about in some of the interviews I've done with him before. He talked about in terms of time, when they went to limit their workday to, say, finishing at 5 p.m., they actually found they got a lot more done than when they would just allow themselves to work till sunset. Budgetary constraint is the other thing. You may think, well, having this angel investor on a big farm is the best way to start a profitable farm. You have all this money at your disposal, but it can actually lead to a lot of issues. Overspending, buying the wrong stuff, and applying fiscal constraint, applying time constraint, all these things can help you really scrutinize the choices that you're making. Is this the right choice? How can I make it work with the resources that I have? Time, money, energy, and make it happen that way. And if you go to the beginning of what you had, what JM has, what Ben Hartman has, Elliot Coleman, everybody started with all these unique situations at the beginning that were constraining them, and they found a way to make it work, and then they leveraged that experience, just like you're referring to, over time to newer, bigger, different opportunities. But if you start at the beginning, that constraint can actually be a really good thing.
Absolutely.
Thinking about JM too, when you looked at his farm, La Grillinette, when you first saw that many years ago, what was your thought there?
Well, the first time I saw La Grillinette was when JM was still on the farm. So he's been off that farm for almost 3 years now. And the first time I saw it, it was still, JM's a maverick. As far as this farming stuff goes, he's a maverick in the sense that he likes to experiment. He likes to try all the new tools. He wants to try all the new techniques, all that kind of stuff. So Le Grillinette back then was very different than what it is now. Back then, it was a very, very scaled down version of what Le Farm de Quatre Temps is. It's minus all the really fancy, probably $500,000 in the post-harvest station, on the nursery, like all these really expensive piece of infrastructure they have. They didn't have at Le Grillinette, but they did have the technique. And Le Grillinette's a CSA farm, and it more or less has been for its entire inception. They do a farmer's market, and they sell to a couple grocery stores. Now it's a lot more simple. Back then, there was a little bit more experimentation on that's going on now. Like where it's at now. So JM's wife, Maudelaine, runs the farm, and I love Maudelaine's approach because she knows exactly what she wants to get out of life, and she likes the winters off, and so she's customized that farm to pretty much follow that. So it's 5 months off. She cranks it hard for the other 7 months, maxes it out. They do really well. Farm makes a lot of money still, and then she goes traveling and she relaxes. Like, I think it's one of these things that's like a lifestyle.
Yeah, designing the business around the lifestyle.
Exactly. Like, what's your lifestyle? What do you want? What works for you? How do you balance that with your family? And they do it. I mean, Le Grillinette is a beautiful place. The land itself isn't just the farm plot. They have a whole acreage that's forested, and they have a pond. They've got the sauna back there. They've got these cabins that some of their interns stay in. And it's a beautiful space. And like, what a great place to grow up as a kid. My wife and I, Katie, were there shooting some photos of the family. We're working on a new book together, and we had an opportunity to just kind of hang out and kind of get in their space for a little while as they exist as a family, not really on the farm. And it's just what a beautiful place to grow up as a child.
That's it. It's the lifestyle. It's about family, and that's one thing like I like communicating about this space is farming is one tool to get that lifestyle. If you do it in the right way, it can support the lifestyle that you're looking to live. JM's talked about this in terms of finding your mission when it comes to farming. Why are you doing this? Maybe it's about experimentation with tools. Maybe it's experimentation with different cultivars of plants. Maybe it's social change. Maybe you just want to make a lot of money doing this. You got to know your reason when you get into this. If you don't, it's going to make all the work that you put in, those long hours out in the field, the hours in the rain, really hard. For you, when you think about people getting into this sector, how do you advise them to really analyze their mission and say, come up with your why for doing this?
Well, that's where I always start is what is the why? How do you figure that out? I mean, I don't know if there's a formula to that one. It's I guess taking an account of the things in your life that you value and that you enjoy doing, and seeing if you can continue to do those things or enhance those things in this new career path that you're going to make. And this is one thing that I love about farming families. I know pretty much all the farms that I visit are young families about our age, and that's one thing that I love is the integration of how the family fits into the farm and how the farm fits with the family. It's that whole lifestyle. It's that whole system's lifestyle. And to me, that's as a family person now, that's super important to me. It wasn't when I started. That wasn't where I came from. But a lot of my students come from that. They have a family. They want to keep their family together. They want that holistic lifestyle, and they're looking for it. So I think it's really just about taking account of what's really important to you and how do you enhance that, or trim off the fat, or do more of the things that you want to do.
If you identify that why, there's a lot of resources out there to make it happen. I mean, you have this book written by J.M. Fortier, you have this book written by you. What are the differences between these two books? What can people get out of both, or why read one over the other?
Yeah, so they are very different. the places that JM and I are very similar is that we're using the same principal framework for our farms: 30-inch beds, bio-intensive methods, low tillage, a lot of the same techniques there. My aspect is more about how do you make this a profitable business on the least amount of land in the shortest period of time, where JM's book is more looking at the whole system. And I appreciate that, and that's something I've wanted for myself ever since I got into this. Like I've said in previous videos, the only reason I became an urban farmer was because I didn't have any other options, and it was just what was available to me that made the most amount of sense. So what I've learned to do is really approach this as a business, and how to make your production fit within the marketplace around you. And so that's a changing thing. And in my book, I talk about different ways to do that, how you can customize your operation based on that demand, and whether that's transitioning your current job, your 9 to 5, to become a farm, or making that work within your context. But how do you make the most amount of revenue from the smallest piece of land?
And I think that's definitely a different approach than JM has in his book. Like, if you're talking about going into being a CSA farmer, or you're dead set on that, which I'm not sure you should be, but at least if that's one of the options, this is a good book in terms of crop planning for a CSA, looking at the crop rotation. He talks about those block rotations, like you alluded to earlier, that he's doing now, but in the LaGrillinette style. Overall, I think you guys do have a very similar approach to things. I think you're more business-minded. He's more whole farm systems minded. And I think anybody starting out would definitely benefit from reading both of those and kind of blending the techniques. The big takeaway I take from somebody like JM is, why are you getting into this, fitting your farm into that community, balancing out the farm and how you're rotating things around. And like, your big takeaway for me out of this book, and the one thing that I think you came up with amongst many that's really brilliant, is like the CVR, ranking crops, because it gives you a quick way to cipher down. You could read JM's book, and in the appendices, I think there's maybe 30 different vegetable species that he covers in there, and decide you want to grow all 30. You can then apply your CVR rating to say which of those 30 are going to be better for me to grow in my situation.
Right, that's a great way of looking at it.
So a lot of resources out there. JM Fortier, one of the guys leading the way. You'll have a bunch of videos coming out with him probably
Absolutely.
Before this, maybe after this video, but they're on your channel, which we'll link to below.
For sure.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk about JM today.
My pleasure.
And if you enjoyed this one, stay tuned for more videos ahead. If you want to subscribe to Curtis's channel, if you're not already, I suggest you do. Link to that below. Link to both these books below. I've done the audiobook for both of them, so if you don't want to read them, you just want to listen, check them out there. But thanks guys for watching this one.